Welcome back to Washington Watch. I'm Tony Perkins. So good to have you with us. The website, tonyperkins.com. All right, the U.S. State Department released its latest human rights report yesterday and made clear that the previous administration's priorities will not be the priorities of this administration. In particular, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken hailed sexual and reproductive rights as human rights.
It's one of many steps, along with revoking the Mexico City policy, withdrawing from the Geneva Consensus Declaration, resuming support for the United Nations Population Fund, that we're taking to promote women's health and equity at home and abroad. Because women's rights, including sexual and reproductive rights, are human rights.
Well, how many times I need to tell you, elections have consequences really internationally, there's whiplash with what is happening. But Secretary Blinken didn't stop there. He also slammed the recently disbanded Commission on Unalienable Rights that was created under the State Department during the Trump administration by Secretary Pompeo, calling its view on human rights, quote unquote, unbalanced.
There is no hierarchy that makes some rights more important than others. Past unbalanced statements that suggest such a hierarchy, including those offered by a recently disbanded State Department Advisory Committee, do not represent a guiding document for this administration. At my confirmation hearing, I promised that the Biden-Harris administration would repudiate those unbalanced views. We do so decisively today.
With me now to talk about this and more is the former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. Mike, welcome back to the program.
Great to be with you, Tony. Thank you for having me on today, especially here during Holy Week.
Absolutely. And actually, that's probably a good place to start. I'm going to take his last statement, basically dismissing the work that the Commission on Unalienable Rights did. That basically he's saying that there is no hierarchy. All rights are equal. All rights are human rights. But there has to be a foundation. And that is why your administration, the Trump administration and the department under your leadership, put a heavier emphasis on religious freedom.
You know, Tony, it was sad to hear yesterday that the work of the commission that I had put together, but this was people, you know many of them, Tony, people from every major religion, people from across the political spectrum. There were Democrats and Republicans. We put together a commission that was chaired by Professor Mary Ann Glendon, and it was singularly focused on understanding human rights. We are each made in the image of God, and there are a certain set of rights that come with that. And in the American tradition, our founders talked about that and thought an awful lot about that. So we worked really hard, and the commission developed a 60-page document. I hope people will go read it. You can't hardly find it on the State Department website anymore. They have buried it because the progressive left has demanded that they do so. But it's out there. You can find the PDF. It takes just a bit to read. But it comes back to these fundamental rights that we each have because, in fact, we are endowed by our Creator with them and not from some government. And to now watch this administration declare that the government can, in fact, create rights or destroy rights, and that these are political creations, not things that are inherent in the traditions of our country and in the nature of humanity, is something that, I suspect that they probably would consider. But when it's really sad when you see what happens. I've watched people all around the world read the report that Professor Glendon and the commission put together. The world's largest Muslim organization, Nahdlatul Ulama in Indonesia, in Jakarta, had taken this on board. They too were coming to understand human rights in their tradition, and this is something that I think America will regret. But your point about elections having consequences is real, and it's something that I'm committed to continuing to build upon in spite of what the State Department decision was yesterday.
Well, Mr. Former Secretary, just to dwell on this for a moment, because I know we've talked about this, but I think a refresher is good for our listeners. And while this administration has been dismissive, I still think this is a very valuable contribution to our understanding going forward of rights. I mean, what the commission did is they looked at the connection between America's constitutional principles, the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and our U.S. foreign policy. And as you alluded to, that if we approach, as this administration is, that these rights are created, positive rights, is created by the government can take them away. What you were doing and what this commission was doing was going down to the bedrock of what is the foundation of human rights. What are those universal human rights that are given to us by God, not by man? Therefore, they can't be taken away by government. They have to be respected and protected.
Yes, Tony, look, as we talk about this, I'm reminded that the State Department didn't take away any of our rights yesterday. They simply repudiated the central understanding of the American tradition of human rights, the fact that we are deeply endowed with this by God, and that no government can take them away from us. That is a dangerous proposition to suggest somehow that government can grant a set of rights for all of humanity, because we know different nations will come to different conclusions. We know that they will, inside of the United States, different places will come to different conclusions, and these rights are inalienable. This is what our founders spoke of. Government can't take them away. And it's encouraging that I got notes from people all across the United States yesterday when they saw this, regretting what the Biden State Department did yesterday.
But again, they can shelve it, they can deep six it, but the work has been done. It's out there, and my recommendation to our listeners and to others, even at the state level, states ought to resurrect this document and use it as a guide point, a guiding document in terms of the state perspective of these fundamental rights. Because how I see this, maybe you see it differently, but I doubt it, because we see things pretty much the same. I think what they're doing is they're clearing the deck so they can advance their priorities, which are not rooted in fundamental freedoms and fundamental rights, but it's something they want to advance, like this other issue that I talked about, reproductive, quote unquote, reproductive rights. They have to clear the deck in order to advance some of the things that they want to advance.
It was, Tony, it's when the commission was formed, even before it had written its first word or held its first meeting, it was attacked by the progressive radical left as threatening to them. I don't know what's threatening about a historical review of the foundational underpinning of the human rights tradition in the United States of America. I would have thought that a Secretary of State who took this seriously would have been welcomed by the human rights establishment, but in fact, it was not. It's because the reality is they have their favorite things, the things they like, things that they want to reward that are deeply disconnected from the central understandings of the United States of America. You talk about reproductive rights. There was no administration in history that supported women's health in the way that ours did, and there was no administration in history that protected the rights of the unborn with the same seriousness. One can do each of those two things, and we did those. And this administration's headed down a completely different path. Well,
not if you consider abortion health care, which is what the left now has done. If you're talking about women's health, you're absolutely right. The previous administration expanded under your leadership, under President Trump. But again, you may not say this. I can say it more clearly because I'm a radio talk show host. At least that's one of the hats I wear. I think the problem with these fundamental recognized human rights that are rooted not only in our Constitution but rooted in nature is that it stands in the way. Religious freedom as being a fundamental human right, as it is recognized in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Rights of Human Rights, stands in the way of some of the stuff that is being advanced today that the left has made their favorite projects. And they see these fundamental rights, in particular religious freedom, as a hindrance to their reshaping or deconstruction, if you will, of Western civilization. That's how I see it.
Yeah, Tony, in addition to the commission, we also started something that you participated in too. We call it the Religious Freedom Ministerial. That's a fancy name for bringing together faith leaders from all across the world. With the largest human rights gathering in the State Department's history. We started it in 2018. And these were people of every faith. There were Baha'i, there were Muslims, there were Christians, and there were people of no faith who came together that understood that even the right to not practice a faith, this idea that each individual inherently has the right to practice their faith in the way that they wanted to, is something that's not consistent with the progressive left's view of the world. We can see this in their intolerance for the way they treat students on campus who are faithful students, the way that they treat business leaders who are committed to their own faith. To your point, it stands in the way. This practice of one's faith that is, in my view, so central to the world order and to the American tradition is something that fundamentally stands in the way of the progressive left's ideas about how to place their vision for the world on each and every one of us.
And if there's one place that is in focus as intently as it is in our foreign policy, because 80% of the world is very religious. In fact, many of these other countries, while they have a different faith, they still are guided by that faith, and having that understanding and appreciation in our foreign policy, I think, is critical to success.
Tony, you can see it in those nations where the leaders are faithful and disciplined in their own faith, whatever faith that may be. They think about the world in a way that understands that we are connected to something bigger than each of us. We're connected to the idea that there ought to be a golden rule, that every human being ought to be treated in a way that is consistent with their faith. This is a very important grounding in the nations where religious freedom is completely absent, places like Iran, places like North Korea and China. These are the places that the human condition is the most challenged around the world.
Yeah, without question. Along those lines, let me ask you this question for our listeners all across this country and around the world who are very discouraged. And this latest action by the State Department adds to that discouragement and concern. What is your message to believers, not only here in the United States, but around the world that was following America's lead and was encouraged by what happened in the last 4 years, but now it's like they're deflated?
Yeah. My message is be not discouraged. The United States, I think Churchill had it right. In the end, when we've exhausted all the other possibilities, we get it right. And I am confident that faithful leaders across the world, faithful leaders all across America will return our nation to the fundamental understandings that our founders had, and these ideas of protection of the unborn, these ideas about religious freedom, this central understanding of human beings being created in the image of God and therefore having these inherent rights as central to the way we think about our country. We will prevail. We will be successful, and the United States will continue to be the most exceptional nation in the history of civilization.
We just have to do our part, and that is not shrink back in silence or allow the left with their megaphone of the media to drown out that hope that we find. I want one final question for you. And this pertains to one of the countries that you focused on intently. You mentioned just a moment ago the issue of China. We just got a couple of minutes left, but your concern about what we see happening with China.
Well, in a couple of minutes, it's difficult to summarize, but it is the case, Tony, and you have now suffered from this. This is the most repressive regime that has led in China, the Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping. It is the greatest, most existential threat to the United States. Those of us who pushed back against it, they are fearful of. They have sanctioned you now, or threatened to. They have sanctioned me and my family. It's because they know that their foothold is tenuous. And this actually, I'll close here, this actually goes back to what we were just talking about. This is a nation that denies and represses any exercise of religion outside of the state. We know that's not sustainable. We know that model will not work. And we know that the people of China who want to practice their faith, whatever faith that may be, will one day have that opportunity. The Lord will watch over them, and I am confident they will be in a better place 5 or 10 years from now.
And while we have that freedom here, we need to use that freedom to speak on behalf of those that are being persecuted and repressed by their governments, those in China, Iran, and elsewhere. Secretary of State, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, always great to talk with you. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Tony. Bless you. Have a happy Easter.
You do the same.